Did you know that 2 out of every 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? I know it. For me, it was more like 25, because of course it was. I wish keeps had been around when I was younger, because advancements in science have meant that there are now treatments that can combat the symptoms of hair loss and help you keep the hair that you have. Look, it is too late for me. My hair is not coming back, but you didn't have to be like me. You can stop your hair loss early thanks to Keeps. Keeps offers generic versions of the only 2 FDA-approved drugs for treating hair loss. So you might be thinking, oh boy, Simon, this is going to be expensive because it's medicine and I live in America. Well, no. Keeps starts at just $10 a month. So how does it work? Well, for one thing, there's no need to visit a doctor's office. Just schedule a quick online consult, and a bit later, a discreet package is going to arrive at your door, and you can use Keeps in the privacy of your own home. So, if you've noticed that you're losing your hair, that's one problem that's not going to fix itself. Do something about it. Go to keeps.com/biographics or click the link in the description below, and you'll receive 50% off your first order. And let's get into today's video. When the Great War broke out, governments and generals expected it to be a short conflict. But due to a mixture of arrogance and a lack of foresight, generals failed to realize that the evolution in military tech had outpaced the development of military doctrine, strategy, and tactics. As a result, many fronts of the war turned into endless massacres in which artillery and machine gun crews made mincemeat of a poorly trained infantry, attacking with little more than bayonets. Commanders responded by ordering more futile attacks, and if soldiers did not obey, they could risk execution at the hands of their own comrades. It's no surprise then that many such generals have been caricatured as stubborn, idiotic, and despotic tyrants. Prominently featured in such parodies and memes is the Commander-in-Chief of the Italian Armed Forces, General Luigi Cadorna. In today's episode, we will chart his surprisingly peculiar life, which includes tales of kidnapping miracles, and we will assess his legacy of incompetence to understand if it was really deserved. Luigi Cadorna was born on the 4th of September 1850. His birthplace was Polonasa, now northern Italy. Back then, the country was yet to be unified, and so the newborn was a citizen of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Luigi's father was army officer Raffaele Cadorna. He would rise to the rank of general after fighting in the Crimean War and the Wars of Italian Independence. In January 1857, Luigi endured a terrifying adventure. A former steward of the family had been fired for dishonesty, and the man sought revenge by kidnapping the 6-year-old boy. The man sent a message to the Cadornas asking for ransom money. Raphael was out of town, so Mrs. Cadorna took charge. The formidable woman called the police and then led a search party into the nearby woods. The kidnapper suddenly got cold feet and fled to Switzerland, leaving Luigi in the care of 3 peasants who walked him back home. By 1860, Piedmont had annexed Lombardy and Milan after the Second War of Italian Independence. Cadorna Sr. took the occasion to immediately ship Luigi to Milan to attend a military boarding school. Was it to keep his son safe from other bad experiences, or to honor family tradition? Well, perhaps it was just to get rid of an annoying brat, as Luigi's school years are notable for his extreme vivacity and mad pranks, which constantly landed him in detention. The boy was also noted for his intelligence, though, and he graduated with good results. At the age of 15, he entered the military academy in Turin, graduating first in his class and receiving a commission as a lieutenant in 1868. On the 20th of September 1870, the young Luigi had his baptism of fire. Serving under his father, he participated in the capture of Rome, until then part of the independent papal state. The Kingdom of Italy had been unified since 1861, but only now Rome became its capital. Almost all Italian-speaking lands had been liberated from foreign dominion and influence thanks to alliances with France and Prussia. But in the northeast, the surrounding regions, Trent and Trieste, still belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italian policymakers and the military still yearned to annex those lands. But in 1882, Rome signed the Triple Alliance with Vienna and Berlin. This agreement had been orchestrated by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, one of the components of his system of alliances to maintain stability in Europe. The deal was advantageous enough for Italy and Austria-Hungary, but these uneasy allies still bore a grudge against each other. In the meantime, Luigi had been steadily climbing the ranks. Since becoming captain in 1875, he took to publishing essays essays and monographs, displaying a knack for teaching on advanced military matters. And in 1881, as Assistant Chief of Staff of the 5th Army Corps, Cadorna was relocated to Verona, close to the borders with Austria-Hungary. On this occasion, he took the habit of personally surveying peaks, valleys, mountain passes, and mule tracks, seeking the best positions to either attack the Austro-Hungarians or set up the best defenses. He also started theorizing new infantry tactics, which were to be appreciated by his superiors after some initial resistance. Cadorna's doctrine emphasized hard discipline, but he also stressed individual initiative, which was blasphemy at that time and place. Subordinate officers and even NCOs needed to have a clear understanding of the war's aims to guide their decisions. He was also a proponent of offensive tactics employed rapidly and constantly to wear out the enemy, which may make sense to a certain extent. Breech-loading artillery and machine guns had been in use since the 1860s. Both weapons and related tactics would give a clear advantage to the defense. This offensive spirit was reinforced in 1892 when Cadorna was appointed colonel of the 10th Regiment of the Bersaglieri, or fast-moving assault troops. While he was in charge, he developed a reputation as an inflexible disciplinarian, exacting harsh punishment for the slightest offense. Gone were the days of the prankster and the proponent of autonomous thought. As a senior officer, Cadorna now placed the stress on unity of command and total obedience. He was still a proponent of fast-moving attacks, though, as he trained his regiment in quick enveloping tactics. In 1898, the colonel received his next promotion and became Major General in charge of a brigade. In the same year, he published a tactical manual which would become the main one in use for the next century. The rise of Cadorna was steady and unstoppable, but it hit a serious roadblock in 1907. In that year, he became Lieutenant General, now commanding a division in Naples. Due to his reputation as a military theorist, General Cadorna was shortlisted for promotion as Chief of the General Staff. But his stance on unity of command did not sit well with the cabinet. The Chief of Staff was expected to share command duties with the King, Victor Emmanuel III, but a stern and even arrogant Cadorna let it be known that in no way would he co-lead with his sovereign. As a result, he was sidelined. The job went to Alberto Pollio, who was much more friendlier to Germany and Austria-Hungary than his rival. Cadorna's bitter pill was sweetened with yet another rise to Corps Commander in 1910. In September of 1911, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The eventual victory for the Italians would yield the colony of Libya and the annexation of the Dodecanese Island. The conflict is also noteworthy for the first aerial attack in which an Italian recon pilot threw hand grenades on an enemy position. Due to his antagonistic relationship with the government, and especially with Prime Minister Giolitti, he was denied participation in the war. Cadorna had to content himself with participating in large-scale war games during which he perfectly executed a fighting retreat. All the while, tensions were building up in Europe. On the 28th of June 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. 3 days later, Chief of Staff General Pollio, the great supporter of the Triple Alliance, died suddenly of a heart attack. On the 27th of July, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Luigi Capello as Pollio's successor. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, there was no expectation for Italy to support its ally. The Triple Alliance only required for Rome to remain neutral. Cadorna set about to quickly reorganize and modernize the army, an arduous task as many resources were swallowed up by anti-insurgency operations in Libya. Plus, his orders for a general mobilization were superseded by the government, as this would violate neutrality. Nonetheless, the general sat down with his staff to plan for what was inevitably to come, a war against the Triple Entente and an invasion of France via the Alps. Well, at least that's what Cadorna thought was going to happen. In reality, Prime Minister Salandra and Foreign Affairs Minister Sonio had been leading secret negotiations with all major European powers. They had been gradually shifting Italy's alliance away from the Triple Alliance and towards Britain and France. The intention was to enter the war against the Central Empire, an occasion to finally annex Trent and Trieste. The new friendship was formalized by the Treaty of London, signed in secret on April the 26th, 1915. So, what did Cadorna know about these cloak and dagger deals? Well, absolutely nothing. When he was informed that he was to attack the Austro-Hungarians, he exploded in a fit of rage, but he set to work nonetheless. All those weeks spent charting the borders would finally come in handy. On the 24th of May 1915, the Italian army crossed the border, opening yet another theatre of senseless gore and massacre. Hundreds of thousands of Italians, Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians, and Poles endured cruel months on rocky terrain, paralyzed by cold and fear, driven insane by artillery, their youth assaulted by machine gun fire. Cadorna amassed the bulk of his troops on a front along the Isonzo River, also known as the Socha. There, the Italians went almost always on the offensive, with rare counterattacks from their enemies. In total, 12 major battles were fought on the river from June 1915 to November 1917. The officer who had once proposed innovative tactics and freedom of initiative developed a strategy that focused on one element only: attack, attack, and attack again. Blood, muscle, guts, and a few bits of metal assaulting enemy trenches, well defended and carved into the stone of the Alpine regions. The infantry was to engage in contact with the enemy as much as possible until they wore them down and broke through their lines. The staff's initial ambitious objective was to march over the enemy capital, but Cadorna reasonably picked a closer objective: the Port of Trieste. If it fell, Vienna would soon be left with little supplies. On the Austro-Hungarian front, the defenders were spurred on to resist all attacks, led by the inspirational leadership of General Borejewicz von Boyner, the Lahn of the Isonzo. On the Italian side, infantrymen were motivated by the draconian discipline imposed by Cadorna and put into practice by the inflexible military police. On one hand, Cadorna relied on sheer manpower as the chief weapon. On the other, he neglected to look after his men's needs. Breakdowns in morale led to desertion and mutiny. Commanders retaliated with even harsher measures in a vicious cycle of retribution and plummeting will to fight. As early as May 1915, the inflexible general issued orders against malingerers, invoking the use of penal law against these vile liars. In June, he directed his iron fist towards officers, demanding that unit commanders up to the regiment level should be immediately sacked if deemed not up to the task. In September, the strictest measures were implemented against troops charged with insubordination and cowardice. General Cadorna wrote in a circular that soldiers trying to surrender or retreat shall be reached by the summary justice extracted by the lead shot from the rear guard or from the military police, unless they haven't already been gunned down by their officer. If surrendering soldiers were to survive their own compatriots, Cadorna would ensure that they were tried in absentia. Should they ever return from a POW camp, they would be executed. These measures were to be meted out on individual soldiers initially, but in October, Cadorna gave carte blanche to extend punishment to entire units at once. In a latter dispatch, he suggested that soldiers may be picked up at random and sent before the firing squad. Things went from bad to worse in November. Cadorna's staff authorized the use of friendly artillery fire if a unit refused to leave their trench and attack the enemy. A statistical exercise in 1925 quantified the casualties caused by Cadorna's regime of terror. 4,028 soldiers were sentenced to death, of which 2,967 happened in absentia. 750 men were eventually killed by the firing squad. In addition to these sanctioned executions, a recent research piece found that some further 300 soldiers had been shot without trial by their officers or the military police. In the general's antiquated worldview, this system of ruthless retribution should have tightened the cohesion and discipline of the troops. All it really did was destroy their morale and resolve. And it wouldn't take long before the front line would crumble. On the 15th of May 1916, the Austro-Hungarian Empire launched one of its rare attack operations, the Spring Offensive. 2,000 artillery pieces unleashed a well-aimed barrage, followed by 300,000 troops pouring in from the Trent region into Venetia. Well trained by their German allies, the attackers exploited weak defensive points to penetrate deep behind enemy lines. The initially stunned Italians suffered heavy losses, but eventually they managed to react. Cadorna was not a tactical genius, but he knew one or two things about logistics. He made good use of the local railway networks to redeploy troops where most needed. By early June, the Austro-Hungarians were running out of supplies and the Italians pushed back. At the same time, the Russians launched their mighty Brusilov Offensive on the Eastern Front. Units were badly needed elsewhere, and the imperial operation lost momentum. Thus far, Cadorna had a well-deserved reputation for stubbornly refusing advice from peers and subordinates. However, historian James F. Gensch argues that he did implement some tactical innovations, either developed locally or imported from other fronts. What Cadorna did fail to implement was an agile communications system allowing for quick dissemination of successful tactics. Innovations imported from the Western Front were especially slow to reach Cadorna, and even slower to cascade down his chain of command. But on this occasion, the general had been hit on the face with a new, harsh lesson taught to him by his enemies. It was time for payback, and for once he wouldn't do it with yet another relentless frontal assault. Displaying again his logistical skills, the general amassed the brunt of his armies and heavy artillery to a section of the front facing the town of Gorizia. On the 6th of August 1916, Italian artillery pounded at the Austrian positions on Mount Sabatino. Specialized infantry units went on the attack, carrying large white discs on their backs, a stratagem which allowed artillery spotters to adjust their aim. Another column captured the enemy trenches, approaching them via a maze of galleries. The mount fell in 38 minutes, and the attacks continued with heavy losses on both sides. By the 8th, Cadorna had captured Gorizia, his first major victory since the start of the war. Within 2 weeks, his army had made more territorial gains than in the previous 15 months of war. But in a recurring Great War scenario, the victorious offensive was slowed down by a lack of supplies, exhaustion, and heavy losses. The front line stalled again for yet another year of fruitless head-on battles on the Isonzo. Even Cadorna had to admit that his soldiers' sanity was approaching breaking point, and that execution by firing squad was not the only answer. In July of 1917, he circulated yet another disciplinary order in which he encouraged officers to look after the morale and well-being of their troops. As he put it is necessary to react against the danger of the depression of the soldiers' human values. But it may have been too little too late. Yet another enemy offensive was on the horizon. In August of 1917, Cadorna masterminded another massive push, the 11th battle on the Isonzo. His orders were executed by General Luigi Capello's Second Army, who rained hell on the Austro-Hungarians with more than 5,000 artillery pieces. The barrage was followed by intense aerial activity and the first operational use of the Arditi, special units of trench raiders. The result was a tactical Italian victory, which worried enough their enemies to call in support from the German allies. And so it was that on the 24th of October 1917, German and Austro-Hungarian troops launched the most effective offensive on the Alpine front so far. A short barrage of explosive grenades and gas was immediately followed by infantry trained in infiltration tactics, a well-planned, well-executed attack which broke through the lines defended by Capello's Second Army. General Cadorna had received some intelligence on the oncoming attack and had warned Capello about it, but his directives were unclear and he failed to follow them up. Eventually, the Second Army had not properly strengthened its defenses and it was overrun. Cadorna was also taken by surprise, but relying on his previous wargame experience, he managed to save the entirety of the Third Army and part of the Second Army by organizing a fighting retreat. The rest of his forces, though, had been beaten back severely. By the 12th of November, the Italians had been driven back by almost 200 kilometers, losing any gains made during the war and even large swaths of national territory. They had suffered 40,000 dead or wounded, 300,000 were missing in action, and a further 300,000 had been made prisoners. It was a disaster which almost knocked Italy out of the war. But as World War I has taught us, every offensive must stall sooner or later. Cadorna managed to reassemble his forces on a new, narrower front along the river Piave. From there, the Italians managed to hold back the invaders, who had themselves suffered 50,000 casualties. The fight had now moved onto Italian territory. It wasn't any longer a war of aggression against their neighbors, but rather a struggle to defend the motherland. Morale skyrocketed, helped in no small measure by the prompt arrival of French and British divisions. But after the rout, Cadorna's own morale had reached an all-time low, so much so that he contemplated suicide. One night alone in his office, he was about to raise a revolver to his head when a mysterious young friar walked in. He carried a smell of roses and had bleeding wounds on his hands and wrists. The two talked at length, and the friar, calmly and serenely, dissuaded the general from taking his own life. Now, allow me to flash forward to 1920. The war is over, and Luigi Cadorna travels to a Franciscan convent to meet a friar rumored to work miracles. Upon seeing him, Cadorna exclaims, "He is the friar who visited me," to which the friar replies, "We went through a rough night, General, didn't we?" In 1917, the friar was serving as an army medic in Naples, so how could he possibly have been in northern Italy on that night? The clergyman later became known to Catholics worldwide as Saint Pio of Pietrelcina. So, had he saved Cadorna's life with a miracle of bilocation? I'll leave the matters of faith to those better qualified. What we know for sure is that immediately after the defeat, Cadorna's behavior was perceived by his soldiers and public opinion as far from saintly. In a widely circulated telegram to the government, he appeared to lay the blame for the debacle on the troops on the ground. According to the dispatch, the defeat was the direct consequence of a moral breakdown, its terrible effects weighing on the shoulders of those who did not fell their responsibility as soldiers and as men. In fairness, the assessment had been co-authored by the General and the Ministry of War, and it singled out only certain elements of the Second Army. But the recently appointed Prime Minister Orlando already had a proposal to dismiss Cadorna sitting on his desk. The defeat at Caporetto and his perceived scapegoating of the troops was the occasion Orlando was waiting for. The stern and aggressive general did not have many friends in the army, nor in the cabinet. So Orlando and the king removed Cadorna from command by appointing him Italy's representative at the Supreme Allied War Council. In this capacity, the former chief of staff served quite well. His advice was respected by Allied counterparts, and he displayed a talent for working in political and diplomatic environments. In the meanwhile, Orlando appointed as new commander-in-chief the General Armando Diaz, who immediately set out to improve the living conditions and well-being of the troops. With heightened morale, further Allied support, and the introduction of the Arditi trench raiding corps, the Italians scored decisive victories on the Piave River in June and October of 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, exhausted by a taxing war, marred by internal dissent, politically fragmented, was already dissolving, with its constituent nations breaking away and declaring independence. On the 3rd of November 1918, the once glorious empire quit the fight and signed an armistice in Padova. The war was over, and so was Cadorna's career. A formal inquiry had fixed the blame of Caporetto on Cadorna's shoulders, and the general was forced into retirement in 1919. His position was briefly and partially reinstated by Benito Mussolini, who appointed him field marshal in 1924. During that period, Cadorna also served as a senator, but never adhered to fascism. By the time of his death on the 21st of December 1928, he had fallen into relative obscurity. More than 100 years after the end of the war, the debate is still ongoing. Was Luigi Cadorna the most incompetent and cruel general of World War I, whose memory should be reviled and ridiculed? Historian Holger Herwig lucidly lists all of Cadorna's flaws. He ignored terrain and weather, underestimated the importance of supplies, stressed the will to fight over everything else, devised strategies with little relation to reality, and insisted on his own infallibility. Most importantly, he neglected the basic requirements of his troops and fostered the use of capital punishment and summary executions. Herwig does point out the same flaws were shared by his opponents, though. On the other hand, James F. Gensch highlighted that Cadorna was logistically and strategically skilled. And while his tactics initially lacked imagination, he was more inclined to learning than initially thought, a trait which yielded some important successes. Furthermore, Cadorna's conduct during the rout of Caporetto was less disastrous than the Italian propaganda would lead us to believe. His conclusion is that Luigi Cadorna was neither an incompetent fool nor a military genius. He was just another World War I general who adapted too slowly and too late to a world changing beyond recognition. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.